Welcome back to Straight Talk with Billy Kay. I'm Billy Keyserling, who has the great fortune of being the mayor of the city of Beaufort. The purpose of this show, plus the newsletters I send out and my website, is to try to keep the people of Beaufort and surrounding areas informed of what's happening. About 6 months ago, Senator Lindsey Graham spoke to a group at the Chamber of Commerce, and he taught us a new word, and that word was sequestration. It's something the Congress and the administration had come up with, but many people in the outside world really didn't know, other than that it was a function of the impasse of creating a budget in Washington and keeping our government going. Today I have with me, as I did 6 months ago, Colonel John Payne from the Military Enhancement Committee of the the Beaufort Regional Chamber of Commerce. At that time, then President of the Chamber, or Chairman of the Chamber, John Rembold, was on with us. And we sort of talked about what sequestration was. And for those who didn't see that show, why don't we start, John, with a brief explanation, if you can, of what sequestration is, and then we'll get into what it means, then we'll get into what it means to Beaufort, then we'll get into what we've tried to do as a community to protect.
I think maybe the easiest way to think of it is to compare it to a jury being sequestered. Instead of sequestering 12 people and putting them in a room, they sequester money and put it in a room and say you can't touch it.
And then when they do that, there are ultimately effects, because you take a chunk of the federal budget aside, and all of the agencies, except those that are sacred, the entitlements, are at risk. Clearly that becomes a huge risk to our Department of Defense, and anything that's a risk to the Department of Defense is a risk to our 3 military installations, which creates a risk to the people who have businesses in Beaufort, the people who rent homes in Beaufort, the people who have stores in Beaufort, and the families who live in Beaufort, both military and non-military, because we have a lot of civilian employees.
Absolutely.
At that point, the Chamber, along with local governments and the state, were mobilizing to see what, if anything, citizens could do to have an impact to fix a problem that the Congress and the administration couldn't fix. So let's talk a little bit, if you will, about the campaign. So we have basically a meat-axe approach. A certain amount of money's gone. The different agencies have to figure out where to go, but it will probably have taken place by the time this show gets on the air.
Unfortunately, it probably will.
But as of the day we tape it, the Congress and the administration are still at odds over what day it begins. Does it begin on Friday? Does it begin on Saturday? Which, personally, I'm not going to speak for the Chamber or for Colonel Payne, but lets us know how dysfunctional our government really has become.
It's become very political.
Personal view, dysfunctional and political. But you did mobilize.
We did.
A committee was created. Let's talk about the committee and what the committee's done.
The committee has primarily been informational. When we had our last meeting 6 months ago, no one in the city of Beaufort even knew what sequestration was or how to pronounce it. And so it's been our goal to make everybody aware of what sequestration is and the damage that it will do. In addition to the economic damage that it will do to our community, it will do a great deal of damage to our national defense, because the Department of Defense has already told all of the military services that, hey, we have to delay 3rd and 4th quarter maintenance and operational training. And that means that if we have to send those troops into a hostile situation, they go in with equipment that's not ready and training that's not up to par.
Right.
That's not right.
And what we failed to admit was that the Department of Defense had actually already given up in the proposed budget $500 billion over the next 10 years, and this would actually double it to about $1 trillion.
But
when you can postpone it, you can work around a budget. You can juggle things.
That's right.
And when we went through BRAC, you could negotiate and try to figure out what your assets were and how to line them up. In this case, because you don't have a Congress that's speaking to itself or to the administration, giving Department of Defense really very little, if any, instructions, it's become a waiting game for 6 months.
Mm-hmm. It really has.
And so what are the kinds of things? You educated the community, you did a number of events and news stories, public meetings. You made your best efforts. I say you, I think it's we, because you represent us as a community. Made our best efforts with our congressional delegation.
We've been to Washington on one occasion and plan another trip to Washington in April or May. But the folks in Washington already know what they want, and their opinions are already cast in concrete.
So do you get sympathy?
On some sides.
On some sides. Well, I'm going to put you in an unfair position because I know the answer. If you speak to 6 members of our, 7 members now of our congressional delegation, and our 2 senators, is there any uniformity in what they want?
I think so.
In South Carolina?
I think so. The military is a huge employer in South Carolina, and they're pretty unified in their stand against cuts that not only cut the fat but get into the muscle.
But only under certain conditions, and that is that they don't like the administrations or the opposition, we'll call them, parties, alternative to the other side of the equation, and that is raising revenues. So the fight is primarily over how do you raise revenues as much as it is about the cuts. The cuts are being held hostage.
They are?
To the impasse on what is the revenue side. Is that a fair way to put it?
I think it is.
So we can say that certainly from what I've had, Senator Graham, Senator Scott, our congressional delegation all see the importance of this, but there are only 7 out of 535
That's right.
individuals, and the 535 individuals are only half of the equation because the administration is the other half of the equation.
They're only and they're in a minority.
Have you seen? I think we're going to break in a minute, but maybe we can start now. Is there something? Do you see anything positive coming out of this?
Anything positive? I think a realization of where we are and how to not get in this situation again. We can't afford to be a superpower and behave like this. We have been the stabilizing power in the world for the last 60 years. And quite frankly, our friends are looking at us with a jaundiced eye right now.
How do you think, I was talking with someone this morning, and I said if we learned lessons from the recession, and I'm afraid we didn't learn many, it's almost self-corrected itself in spite of the Congress and the administration, to a large extent, because private sector decided they were going to do things differently, and they're recovering. They may not be hiring as many people, but they've learned new ways of doing things. So I guess my question, and something that you and I have had offline conversations with, and I have offline conversations with the heads of our bases and even with the general who's in charge of East Coast operations for all of the bases about the future. You can't determine the future, of course, until you find out what happens on Friday.
That's right.
Friday or Saturday. But it's my understanding, if there's an insider's view, that there's been very little direction to those who are going to have to implement. In other words, Washington has given very little direction to the heads of our bases in terms of what the expectation is going to be either way.
I believe that.
Other than the fact that we're going to have to
cut back.
Have to create measures of austerity, which is what we've done in local governments. Not to compare the city of Beaufort with 12,500 people and a $14 million budget with the federal government or the Department of Defense. But it is a microcosm, and we're going to take a break. But when we come back, let's try to think out of the box a little bit about what more we as a community can be doing to a Washington that is unresponsive, and what we as a community can do to engage our men and women in uniform, who have certainly given of their lives to defend our country. So we'll be back with Straight Talk with Billy Kay and Colonel John Payne in just a minute. Thank you. Welcome back to Straight Talk with Billy Kay. I have as my guest today Colonel John Payne, who is a very significant player in the Military Enhancement Committee, which is an initiative spearheaded by the Beaufort Regional Chamber of Commerce with the support of governments, businesses, and the community at large. For the past 6 months, they've been trying to wrestle with how people in Beaufort can try to help Washington understand and make some tough decisions that have a huge impact on our men and women in uniform and our community at large. I think we concluded and we agreed that no matter how much, quote, lobbying you do, everybody's really sort of locked in. No one will disagree that the meat axe is not the way to run a business or to run a government, but they're locked in on the revenue side. So by the time this show goes on the air, a decision will be made, which will be to kick the can down the road. Meaning postpone, keep everybody hanging on the edge and waiting again for Congress, which we've been waiting for how many years now when you think about it. Or they will basically have said sequestration has begun, everybody go to work. And first, let's talk a little bit about the formulas for sequestration, because it's not like coming to John Payne Enterprises, the business, and saying to your managers, we've got to cut by X percent. It doesn't quite work that way with sequestration, because as I understand, it's more cutting line by line rather than giving...
Everything takes the same percentage cut.
Rather than giving the manager the flexibility to juggle resources.
And that's what BRAC does. Right. BRAC gives the military installations or the military services the ability to say, listen, this is more important than this, so let's cut the budget on this rather than that. And that makes a lot of sense. Right. If you were running a corporation, that's the way you would do it.
That's the way we would run a business. That's the way the city of Beaufort runs a budget. We anticipated a 20% decrease in revenue as we went into the recession. We pulled everybody in the room. We took, out of $100, we threw 20 and set them aside and said to all of our staff, you've got 80% of what you had. Now, how are you going to continue to maintain, if not improve?
You're going to do everything that you've done in the past.
Everything you've done in the past.
20% less.
20 less. But with the meat axe approach, it's basically, we've essentially, Congress and the administration are basically turning the management of many functions of our government, the one we're focusing on is the military, into basically bean counters who are going to go through budget lines with calculators and take a percentage off the lines rather than moving the lines apart.
Rather than doing it intelligently.
That's right. So they're going to be stuck. So I don't think, to my knowledge, and I don't know anything that the public doesn't know, because very little is being talked about.
At this point, by the time the show airs, it probably will be, but at this point, that's
exactly
we
right.
don't know.
We've seen some stories about one piece of what would happen at Marine Corps Station was that they would furlough civilian employees. They could furlough. They might have to furlough civilian employees by 20%, so they'd work and get paid for 4 days a week instead of 5. That, in the scheme of things, is probably not a big. Huge, even though personnel is a huge item in a budget.
If you think about it, it's bad, but it's not going to cause starvation any place, and most of those people probably are not going to go hunt for a new job because they know that someday their job will be back, someday in the not too distant future.
It does mean they might not buy that new car.
Absolutely.
It does mean they might not
means that,
move into that new
restaurants
house.
are really going to hurt because they're not going to go out for as many meals out.
That's right.
They're not going to have a big Christmas that they might have had, and they're probably not going to go on vacation this summer.
They're not going to have fuel to run their boats on the water. I mean,
That's right.
It's going to change their lifestyle.
It will.
And it will change Beaufort at a time where, interestingly, notwithstanding everything, we have more sales in our restaurants this year than we've had in years past. So I guess we got a little cushion, but the whole point is not to move up and then slide back.
And then slide back.
You know, I have with our city manager and sort of a group of people been thinking a little bit out of the box. When we organize around BRAC, and I think the single best example, and I think it's an example for the nation, of what Beaufort County did with the joint land use.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely it
where
is.
we participated by using public dollars matched against federal dollars and some private concessions to basically make sure that the airspace was protected, which is an asset for a base, especially in some communities where the community feels that they're encroaching. So we were very good there. We've taken that to the next level, to the concept of transfer of development rights, so that instead of paying for it, we're allowing people to move the value of a piece of property over here to sell it to someone over here and build more density there to have less density there. The question is, what if anything, and it may be nothing. You know, I believe, and having learned a great deal in the city and having spent a good bit of time in Washington, you know, it's a lot easier with 5 people on the city council that are elected nonpartisan
Yes.
with at large. But I believe that if we can find a way to take this mammoth organization called the Department of Defense and find ways like we did with joint land use to partner with them, are there certain things that by their working with us, MCAS, Paris Island, the Naval Hospital, working with the city of Beaufort, the town of Port Royal, are there certain ways that we can help them save some money?
Certainly there are.
Are there public goods that could be done? Now, this is somewhat unfair, but it's a blatant example of where we have sort of gone wrong. I went to the most beautiful fitness center I've ever seen, which was just opened at Marine Corps Air Station.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's a different budget. It comes to the Navy. It was budgeted years ago. But at the same day you go to see this incredible fitness center, you're reading that there may be furloughs for the civilian employees. And the fundamental question that I've been asking the Department of Defense, are there certain things, if you spent $2 million upgrading the YMCA, or because the Department of Defense says we need world-class athletes, and that's a good, and a fitness center, I don't argue, is a good investment for our national security. But do we need a building that's going to have to be maintained, it's going to have to be operated, and it's going to be fully responsible, the responsibility of the military? When we have some fitness centers here, we have some gyms here, we have some trainers here, couldn't we be collaborating? Movie theaters,
but are
grocery
they
stores.
convenient enough that people will use them, that the troops will use them?
Well, they've been using them. If I go to the YMCA every morning, I see military personnel and civilians who work on the bases there. And Beaufort is not a huge place. If a family member, because this is open to family members, goes from Laurel Bay to get onto the base, is the Omni that far away? Maybe if we get our rail to trail, they'll be able to ride their bicycles, which is part of fitness as well. So the question is, can we just have a discussion, which is what we've been asking the Marine Corps. If we can mow your grass in non-secured areas for less money than you can, is that worth talking about?
I'm afraid after sequestration, the grass isn't going to get mowed, period.
We may end up mowing that. We maintain the state highway rights of ways because the state won't do it, but we do see, from the city's perspective. MCAS
There are some. That may or may not be an ideal example, but there are some areas where we can cooperate. Some of the other installations in the state have already begun to do that. I've had several people say, why are we so dependent on the military? I don't know, why is Detroit so dependent on the
It's,
auto
it's industry. It's
Yeah.
part of our industrial
do it
economic
well.
driver factor, and we do it very well.
Geographically, we have all of the assets that that the Air Wing and a training installation like Parris Island require, and that's good. That has brought jobs to Beaufort.
Exactly. One of the most exciting things to me is that our seemingly failed but now revived Economic Development Alliance has, when we lost Jasper County as our partner, went to Sumter and have formed what we call the Base Alliance, Beaufort and Sumter Economic Alliance. Because as the Secretary of Commerce has said, and we know that even though it's the Air Force and the Army in Sumter, and we have the Marines and the Navy here, there's certain kinds of discussions where cities can be more helpful. And I think that's the future. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but you get the last word.
Well, I think we're headed in the right direction in Beaufort. We have a very supportive community. The Department of Defense wants to spend its money on training, not on lawsuits from people that don't want it there.
Well, good. Well, thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
By the time this, as we've said, by the time this show airs, we'll know some of the answers that we've been speculating about, and we'll be able to come back and talk about how we respond to whatever it is we face.
That'll be fun.
Thank you, John. Thanks for being with us.